Right, today we are going to be talking about women and OP art, which is short for optical art, and with like optical illusions and things like that, and then the civil rights movement and art with women. So here are the topics for the lecture. Again, OP art, the background, women in OP art, and then just the background for civil rights movement, and then the women that we're going to be looking at specifically for that. So let's start with OP art. As I mentioned, it is short for optical art. It was a movement in the 1960s, or started in the 1960s. It continued on. It didn't obviously there was a big movement around the 60s and 70s, but it's still around today, just not quite as popular as it had been in the past. And the general characteristics are geometric forms to create optical illusions. And specifically, the idea is that the paintings are known for using the use of perception and how patterns, colors, lines all influence the viewer and how we view things. And in fact, there's like implied art, which implies, like, let's say cloth or glass, but optical illusion, like art that has the illusion component in it, which OP art is that it's actually messing with your eyes. So if you stare at this image right here, right, in different ways and long enough, it looks like it's moving. You have a little bit of the circle moving like horizontally, and the other part, the background, moving vertically, and so it creates this kind of slightly vibrating almost image. Sometimes it's a wave, sometimes it's a swirl, sometimes it's just this kind of movement. And what it's actually doing is it's tricking our eyes in how we see and how our eyes actually perceive things based on using these geometric forms, using flashing and vibrating patterns, swelling or warping, wavy lines, color, lines close together, all of these things. And then the contrast, we could put that to the contrast, which black and white is the most obvious, but the OP art has color too and stuff. But all of those things play a role in how you use them and put them together to create, again, that kind of visual messing with our eyes, to have it look like it's moving, or that it has some actual kind of um, hidden image, movement, vibration that's taking place, and is meant to not only give the illusion of this three-dimensional space, but impressions of light and shadow. All of those things play a role in that. And of course, the goal is also to have you kind of question reality and what you're seeing, and whether that's something that, is this, if I'm seeing this and it's not actually taking place, how does that impact my perception on the artwork? How does that, impact my perception on life? In all of those areas is kind of what it was meant to do. So the roots of op art can be traced back to Impressionism, Cubism, the Dada movement, and the Bauhaus practices. All kind of pull from various aspects of those which we've looked at. Not Cubism, but we've looked at Impressionism a bit. But Dada and Bauhaus we have. It challenged, of course, traditional art view of arts. There is also a connection we should probably put in here too. There is a connection to pop art. There is some overlap in some of what the art that's done and how it reflects pop art as well. And certainly in the sense of what pop art did with challenging the traditional views of art, the op art is doing the same thing in that. And it was meant to, it definitely was not only challenging that, but was intertwined with the counterculture movement that was taking place with the push of the civil rights, the women's rights movement, all of this kind of counterculture resistance to traditional, societal views, and through life in general, and then of course within art itself. And so this also could be connected. The other one I guess going to put on the list is kinetic art here. which is movement, and I have actual movement. So actual kinetic art has actual moving pieces, and some artists combined both the op art and the kinetic art together to create a whole kind of uh, secondary layer of movement and how we perceive movement in that process and stuff like that. The This type of art eventually found its way into fashion, graphic design, advertising, stuff like that. Here you can see, right, this was on the runway with models, and it's on the clothing, right? So you have the designs. Now, of course, there isn't always necessarily the same optical illusion that op art is portraying in the image we saw before, but it's borrowing from that style and tradition in the process, right? Designers incorporated that. They liked the use of the bold, eye-catching designs in their collection, which you can see very bold lines, shapes. That black and white contrast was definitely part in that. Besides, in dresses and skirts, designs were also popular, and it's like especially even more so than dresses. It was popular in scarves, and what's the word there with that, bags, like purses. There we go. Probably lost the name. Purses and bags, and jewelry as well. So, and I would argue that you probably actually saw more of this style on those accessories, if you will, than in clothing, but it certainly showed up in clothing, like especially in the 70s. There were quite a bit of style of clothing and even some furniture, but that was a much smaller amount. So dresses and skirts, yes, but those accessories, right, with the scarves and purses, bags, jewelry, you saw it quite a bit. It was also used in album covers, and we're going to talk about Bridget Riley uh, in a little more detail in a minute. She certainly was one of the most significant artists to have an impact on this kind of graphic design, and especially her bold geometric patterns and optical illusions. And she kind of was the bedrock of this movement in many ways. And while there were some well-known male artists, she was one of those where it wasn't just like, okay, well, here's the male artist and everyone knows them, but look, here are women artists that were also part of this. Bridget Riley was the known op art artist for sure, even surpassing some of the male op artists at the time. So that's something we haven't seen too often, where like their woman artist is more well known than the male artist in the same genre of art. But this influence, like her stuff, definitely kickstarted off the use in various like designs, advertisements, and even in some movies and things like that. So, for example, you have in the Beatles, the Revolver album cover featured a black and white op art illustration of the band members' faces. The swirling kaleidoscope design became an iconic image during this time. For that, you had in movies and TV shows, for example, in the opening credits of James Bond, the Dr. No film, it featured a swirling op art pattern with a psychedelic visuals and bold and colorful sets. Also, Batman. Anytime like there was like transitioning from like scenes, the Batman and Robin, also the TV show, used that swirling feature. But even like James Bond, where like the opening credits, where they started doing it in a lot of them later in more modern times, where he shoots through like the barrel and it's moving, that's definitely op art inspired as well. Here you can see a Ford advertisement, and they're using the design to make it look like they're driving through a tunnel or driving fast, right? So it kind of is that it was meant to imply this type of speed, and they're going through a vortex and super fast. Twilight Zone was also very popular in using op art in the TV show. And then of course the New York subway map had influence in the late 60s when it was created. An American Airlines logo There were lots of things. It was very popular to be used in advertising and graphic design for a while because of this kind of new style. And the other thing was that op art, like pop art, was easily able to be kind of mass produced. It was easily connected to consumption and consumerism in many ways, because it was eye catching, it was bold, all of these things. And also could be bright colors and stuff, geometric patterns. It provided a great like kind of contrast to whatever it was that they were highlighting or showcasing in advertisements or like in album covers or in movies and TV shows. And I think with the album covers too, uh, for bands, right? This is, if you go into the like 70s with the psychedelic era in general, op art fit perfectly within that structure, right? Ford did several series with this, and the Ford Mustang was marketed with these as well. Again, to do this sense of speed and excitement, like you see here in this image as well. Pepsi launched a series of ads with bold and abstract designs. So super common became incorporated into kind of like everyday items that people bought because it was so easily transferable in that process. All right, so let's look at Bridget Riley's contributions. And again, she was the best known op artist, not just for women. She was famous for her visually captivating contributions here. These are two separate ones, but you can see this one's that wavy one, and this is the spiral. So it looks like it's kind of rotating and stuff like that. Her ability to have like optical illusions was one of the things she was most well known for, and really was kind of seen as I wouldn't say she's the founder of op art, but she certainly was the go-to name of op art at the time. Especially anyone in the art world, if they mentioned Bridget Riley, people knew who she was. So again, definitely having a higher position and recognition than even some of the male op artists is significant, and something that we really haven't seen up to this point in that process. So with her stuff, her works, of course, are always seen as not only having a lot of geometric forms and high contrast, but were abstract and about the visual experience. That was a big part of this idea of how you see and perceive and connect to this kind of unique visual experience in her art. She was born in 1931 in London. She studied at Goldsmiths College and the Royal College of Art, and then worked as an art teacher for several schools. She did some other styles before she got into op art, but by the 60s had created her first abstract op art that she's best known for. And so she does the other kind of genre stuff she played around with in her earlier years. People don't really connect to her, but she became famous for her op art, not her other art and stuff that she did. She was known for experimenting with geometric shapes, abstract forms, black and white lines, different colors in order to create, those various optical illusions and movements. She added the curved lines here later to create a wave-like painting. And then in the Gala work, it shows the color contrast and wavy lines, which is this one here, right? So you can see, so she started off with a black and white and then moved to this style after. And again, playing with the contrast, the positive and negative shape with the lines, the positive negative lines. So you have that contrast, having lines close together. And it's hard to see, but if you look right, you can see there's two colors and then the white, and then two colors, then the white, then two colors. And having having the lines really close together with contrasting color, and then the contrast of the white and color is all what's creating this optical illusion in that process. So, I mean, you do have to play around and understand how it works, because if you do certain type of designs and shapes. It's going to look cool, but it's not going to create that optical illusion. And again, not all of op art was optical illusion, even though it stands for optical art. It was about the visual experience. But Bridget Riley's art almost all was in it for a period was all about the optical illusion movement. She does expand beyond that some with her travel work that she does here, where she started creating pieces from trips to Egypt and India that represented impressions of these regions. And so she has one was the Kian, which was inspired by ancient tomb paintings and landscapes in Egypt. And then the one that was referring to Hindu mythology and the god Shiva, all of which is often depicted as the Lord of Dance. The goal of these, right? So this travel art, it wasn't meant to look like, a scene from Egypt or from India. But the idea was, it was inspired by her own perceptions of the world, and this idea of taking the feelings and emotions and perceptions of what she saw and learned when she traveled, and putting that into kind of a visual emotion or feeling. And that's what her travel artwork kind of did. And at the same time, was meant to examine perception and how we see things. Not only with the optical stuff, which of course was directly about how our actual eyes process visual stimuli, but that what we perceive, how we perceive them are not always what they seem to be. So again, it goes into that abstract art category. Clearly, I think that's especially seen with like her travel art here, which doesn't have you think, oh, I'm going to see something about Egypt or India, and you're going to see the pyramids or a specific building in India or whatever, or a nature scene. But instead you have this abstract art with a lot of colors and lines and geometric shapes that is meant to be more of a visual representation of her perceptions and feelings and emotions of that trip than a specific visual not symbol, but visual representation of something actually present in that area. So her stuff often got used in advertisements. In fact, a lot of the advertisements and other types of commercial use of op art, many definitely took either directly from her or used her as essentially a reference to create their own style. And definitely the whole optical illusion component was very much replicated from the styles and techniques that she kind of developed during this period. All right, then we have Angela Bullock's art. She worked with sculptures and digital art. Some of her best ones are known as the aluminium, or aluminum as we would say, but aluminium for the British, which is this one here. And then this one is Frieze. And so it played around with this combination of not only sculpture and some illusion in terms of light, but also a digital component as well. It was meant to explore patterns and perceptions in three-dimensional work. Whereas like Bridget Riley's was two-dimensional. It just looked three-dimensional. Angela Bullock used actual three-dimensional artwork in hers. So that's one of the significant differences too, is that the use of two-dimensional art that is an illusion of three-dimensional art, and then actual three-dimensional art through sculptures. She had this heavy metal stack series, which was composed of powder-coated steel structures that actually went up over 6 feet high. And they kind of appear to occupy both 2-dimension and 3 dimensions simultaneously. And you can see that here with this, right? And when you look on them straight on, they look two-dimensional. When you look at them and have them from the side, you can see that it's actually three-dimensional sculpture. And the light and how what colors the lights were and how they were placed also could play with that, along of course with the position of the viewer. But it definitely was meant to play on, again, spatial perception and awareness, as well as a minimalism. Her artwork was much more minimalistic than Bridget Riley's was, for sure, in that process. She also had what was called a Beatville artwork, which incorporated biofeedback into it. This was where you had this drawing machine, and the how it worked is that when you sat on the bench, there was a machine that would paint vertical and horizontal stripes on a wall. So, machine painted, we'll say, stripes on the wall. So this idea of digital and analog, mechanical technology, and op art actually did a lot with that too, of playing with the lines of technology and art, mathematics and art, computers and art, right? All of which were kind of newer developments and forms of things. So how could you integrate and combine the computer, the mechanical, the digital with the analog aspects of sculpture and painting and art in that sense. There was another woman artist, Elena, that she used a typewriter. So she used the typewriter and typed out words and used the words to create different contrasts with positive and negative shapes, and transitioning from one to the other. And that was also kind of playing on that technology and art. Again, also like, unexpected aspects of if the words, you're using typewriter words to form an image, and which end up creating implied circles and implied background because it isn't solidly filled in. So this are the kind of common themes with op art. So let's switch gears and look at some background to the civil rights movement, so that we can then examine some of the art that took place during this time. So there had been various actions and movements before the kind of official civil rights movement took place. So women were actively trying to get the right to vote, even though technically women got the right to vote federally in the 1920s. Black women were still largely prohibited from being able to vote in the South due to segregation and Jim Crow laws. And so many Black women were still continuing to push and fight for that right to vote. Rosa Parks will be an example of that. She was an activist before the Bus Act took place. And so the civil rights movement didn't just pop out of nowhere. There had been pushing for rights and attempts before this. However, you have a series of things kind of converge together. That certainly Rosa Parks sparking the bus boycott led to a domino effect of others, but this was in tandem with the lack of Black soldiers getting the GI Bill after World War II, and also just participating in the war and then coming home and being treated like second-class citizens. This coincided, of course, with the women's rights movement at the same time as well. There was this kind of whole push for rights and increased equality and recognition. That was the sentiment going on at the time. And so it was a variety of things that took place. So this is a kind of slightly oversimplified version of that, but it gives you some background to what was taking place at the time when women artists then were coming in and starting to promote the civil rights movement in their artwork and be a part of that movement. Because naturally, as people wanted to take place in the civil rights movement, artists found that they could use the power of art to persuade, to protest, to highlight women's struggles and life during all of this. So with this, in December 1st of 1955, Rosa Parks, who was a tailor's assistant, had completed her work in the Alabama department store and planned, this was a planned thing. It later got put, like the narrative was that she was just a tired seamstress who didn't want to get out of her seat, but this was a planned thing. She was an activist. She had been pushing multiple times. She had been going to try to get her right to vote. This was a coordinated thing where she decided that she was going to sit in the front. The buses were segregated with white people sitting in the front and a back section for black people. She sat in the front and then refused to move when she was told that she was not in the correct section. This ultimately led to her arrest, which then kick-started off a whole boycott of the Montgomery bus system altogether by all black people. And this wouldn't be probably wouldn't be effective today because the bus system isn't quite as used as it was back then. But the bus system was actively used, especially by the working black population at this time, and brought in a lot of money that way. But just people in general use the bus more than they do in many locations today. And the Montgomery bus system was quite robust in that process as well. After she was arrested, hundreds of black people gathered in local churches and vowed to refuse to ride the buses until accorded equal treatment. And it lasted for 381 days, despite being harassed, having to walk long distances to work. Maids, janitors, teachers, students did not ride the bus. And finally, in 1956, the Supreme Court ruled segregation in public transportation was unconstitutional. And so the bus boycott really marked the beginning or turning point, maybe not the beginning, because I mentioned there was other things that had been going on before, but it certainly was a turning point to a movement for racial justice as a nonviolent crusade. It also marks the emergence of Martin Luther King as the kind of movement's national symbol for the civil rights movement. So it certainly was important. It was done by a woman who kind of kick-started off the much larger mass movement that was going to take place. Right. Then you have other aspects with Eisenhower and civil rights legislation that came into play from this. Congress passed the first national civil rights law since Reconstruction, which was kind of a big deal. The law targeted the denial of black voting rights in the South because, again, technically women and, well, men too, men were denied as well. But like men were supposedly able to vote for a long time, and women had gotten the right in the 1920s, and yet black men and women were actively being denied the right to vote in the South through a series of what they did is they did a poll tax, which of course was the idea of targeting money, that you had to have money to be able to pay for the right to vote. And then they did essentially a test, if you will, that was both like an application and test. So it asked you like background information stuff, but it asked you if you've ever been arrested, and which then they could use to deny. And it didn't matter if it was small. And then the reality is, between the civil rights movement, just being black and walking around, many people have been arrested for innocuous things that then they could use as justification for denying them based on moral grounds. Because one of the end things was, are they of good moral character? And so if all else failed and they made it through most of the stuff, you almost could just check that box and use it as justification to deny someone even if they wanted. But the other part was you had to do a reading and comprehension sorry, that got all messed up there. Of like the state's constitution. For example, Mississippi had They're reading one, and they technically, again, with segregation, separate but equal. They couldn't give like they couldn't blatant. It was blatant though. They weren't supposed to blatantly like give different questions to black applicants versus white applicants, but they did. White applicants would get something like that said, okay, read this part of the Constitution, which says that if you're a citizen of the state, then you have the right to vote. If super simple sentence. And then you had to summarize it in your own words. So you had to read it, you had to write what it means and summarize it into your own words. But then they give black applicants these super long paragraphs that were all legalese speak and very complicated. Even today, for educated people to read, it's complicated, it's not easy. It was intentionally made to be super difficult. So even if someone had a college education, that they were going to struggle with not just reading it, but summarizing it into their own words. And the reality was that there was still a larger black population that was not highly educated because of racism and segregation. And so if you have, and the South in general just had a lower literacy rate anyway. And so that all played a role into this. And so many people, there were several women that repeatedly went back and took the test multiple times because even though they were very highly educated, because it was so difficult, and it was built around this idea of preventing them from voting. And so Rosa Parks had been one of those as well. And so this law was targeting that what they had been doing in the South as not legal. And the North actually participated in the poll tax part of it, and that eventually gets abolished as well. You can't restrict people's right to vote based on income and ability to essentially to pay for that. President Eisenhower wasn't initially strong on the movement. He did call for Americans to follow the laws, but he privately disapproved of the Supreme Court's ruling. And he failed to act when authoring Louis was denied admission to the University of Alabama, which technically went against those new laws that had been put in place. And a mob essentially showed up and prevented her from going to registration. And because she didn't register, then the board of trustees said, "Oh, see, we can expel you." So again, a lot of this denial of rights, it was like they would use not loopholes, but like just this twisted, narrative. Oh, well, okay, fine. We have to let her come to the University of Alabama. All right, you show up to register, but this mob of people prevented her from getting there. Oh, bummer. Well, so you didn't register on time. Now we're kicking you out of the college, right? But that's all just a messed up way of the discrimination and racism, just maintaining that. And he didn't step in and immediately do anything, which was unfortunate in that process. But you also have other things that took place during this time. Of course, and one of the biggest was in Arkansas with the Little Rock Central High School with the forced integration where you had Little Rock 9 and this image is such a powerful image of that, where you had Ruby Bridges and others that before, and then high school students that were all being not forced. They were encouraged by their families to go, and they faced this violent, angry mob yelling at, screaming at them. They had to eventually, the National Guard was actually sent in. So the first day that they tried to go, they couldn't. The National Guard was eventually sent in to enforce integration. And then only after that took place did Eisenhower send federal troops to help. So he eventually, helped out, but he wasn't, he wasn't actively fighting against it, but he wasn't actively helping with these changes as well. So with this taking place, you also then had sit-ins, which were huge. The sit-ins and the Freedom Riders, those are the last two things I want to mention. But these were all massive events in the civil rights movement that all played a huge role in shaping the type of protest in nonviolent style, and that was significantly impactful in that process. You have sit-ins initially occurred in the Woolworth Company store. So how it worked is you see they're at the counter, right? And these diners, if you will, had counter spots where you could sit and eat, and then there were where the picture doesn't show, there were tables that were on the other side, and then went further back into the store. And black people were often denied at these diners, even though with the new laws, there wasn't a separate space for them. Like they couldn't. The law essentially was if you only have the one counter, you can't deny black people from sitting at the counters. And but what most of the stores did is that they actually made them go sit in the back tables in the very back. And so the sit-ins were meant to be this nonviolent protest where they would essentially go and they would go sit at the lunch counter. And if they were served, they would eat and then they would leave. If they were not served and were refused service, then they stayed, they would not leave. They would just continue to sit there at the counter until closing time. Now, the first couple of sit-ins were calm and nothing really took place. But as word in the news organization started to pick up amongst this, not only did the number of sit-ins increase, but the resistance to it. So you can see right in this picture, there's not really resistance going on there, but they weren't being served, but they just sat there. And in this picture, this was after the news and the population got to know more of what was going on, and then you had these mobs that came in to harass them. And these were almost all done by college students. A lot of the protests too, the whole goal was to have a mix of white and black students working together to showcase and protest against this treatment. The Freedom Riders will have this as well. The sit-ins did it as well. They were instructed to there were like rules that they kind of created. Show yourself to be friendly at the counter at all times. Do sit straight and face the counter. Don't strike back or curse. Don't laugh out. Don't hold conversation. Don't block exits. They're supposed to dress, as you can see, very nicely. So you're supposed to dress respectfully, I think is what they said. Now, some of the diners tried to avoid any type of issue by just closing when they knew the sit-ins were going to be around. Others put up no trespassing signs and the signs that said we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. Well, others said closed in the interest of public safety, which of course the goal was to try to not have the students come to their counters and be there. And the hope was if they closed for a week or two, that the students would move on. Ultimately, in 2 weeks, there were 11 sit-ins that took place, or sit-ins took place in 11 cities. There were more than 11 sit-ins. And this movement grew and grew and grew. What ends up happening, of course, is that teenagers and other young, largely white men went into some of these diners and started harassing people. You could see they had stuff poured onto them. They were pushed. They were shoved. And then the cops would come in and arrest the students that were sitting at the counters. That they didn't fight back. They didn't attack, but they were the ones that, of course, were arrested. And of course the white teenagers and students were not arrested as well. When one of the black men that was arrested tried to talk to the judge turned his back when he talked. And he basically said, well, what's the point then, right? He was found guilty and fined $150 plus court fees. Ultimately with this, they started having so many people. As soon as the cops came in and arrest one group, new students would come in and sit down. So that that didn't matter how many they arrested, other students came and took their place. And soon diners realized that if they wanted it to not be this massive issue, the best option was just to serve them, because then they would eat and leave and not make a scene. This was massively impactful to see, again, them respond with nonviolence, to see them not being the aggressors, to see them just peacefully protesting and people seeing on the TV. This is important. Mass media played a huge role. We're seeing that change in art too, but it played a huge role because people were seeing them on the TV for the first time and seeing the kind of treatment that was taking place. And while, of course, people knew and it had been talked about, the same thing with art. Visual, it's why photography, too, became so powerful. Visual representation is powerful. And you can have it described to you all you want, but to see it in photographs and then to see it live on TV really reached out to people in a way to realize, holy crap, this is not okay. And that got more and more people supporting, giving money to bail out these students that were getting arrested and to keep the movement going. And this did lead to other types of violence and stuff that took place for, again, members of the civil rights movement. Alexander Loeby's house was bombed. He was actually conservative, and this angered a lot of both Black and white people. Over 2,500 students and members of the community marched silently to City Hall, and they asked the mayor, "Do you feel it is wrong to discriminate against a person solely based on their race or color?" And he said yes. And after the mayor, again, this just shows what happens when people in authority step up. After he said this, within 2 weeks, 6 Nashville lunch counters began serving Black students, and it domino affected from there. And then lastly, you have the Freedom Riders. There was an early one called Journey of Reconciliation that took place in 1947, which was meant to test the Supreme Court ruling against segregation of interstate passengers, which essentially the law had said that interstate travel segregation was unconstitutional. They were met with super heavy resistance, and many were arrested and thrown into chain gangs, and it deteriorated very quickly. However, the Freedom Riders then picked up in 1961 when the mood was slightly different because they were going into the Deep South, right? It's one thing to do this in like the South. It's another to go into the Deep South and do this. And it was interracial groups, white and Black students, again, traveling to the South. And they intentionally had white passengers sit in the back, Black passengers sit in the front, right? White riders entered Black only areas, Black riders entered white only areas. The whole idea was to reverse that aspect of that, right? The first part of their trip went all right, but they were just in the upper South, if you will. They eventually split into 2 groups to go into Alabama. The first group was met with a mob of 200 people who stoned the bus, slashed the tires, and set it on fire. That's this. They did manage to get out of there. Actually, they got out. Before it was set on fire, was being stoned. The bus was being stoned, and this tire slash. They got out of there, but when they stopped to change the tires, that's when it was firebombed, and that's this incident here. The second bus did not do much better, and several individuals were severely beaten by the mob when they stepped off the bus. In fact, on that scene, when they saw the mob growing, a white student volunteered to step off first because he figured that he was going to get beaten, but he'd get beaten less than if a Black student stepped off first, which was probably accurate. Many ended up going to the hospital for their injuries. Of course, not surprisingly, the bus company was like, and the bus drivers were like, we don't want to keep driving you guys because we're losing buses and the bus drivers are scared for their lives and they didn't sign up to do this. They tried to have negotiations and talks with them, about compensation, but it ultimately failed. Eventually, Robert Kennedy pressured Greyhound into letting them continue and had the Highway Patrol promise to provide protection to Birmingham. Although not surprisingly, 90 miles in, the police cars disappeared and they pulled up to the silent bus stop where then they were... this is the one I was mentioning with the Jim Zweig was a white passenger. He stepped off first and got the beating with the mob and stuff because the police abandoned them in Mississippi. And then after that, Robert Kennedy sent the federal marshals in, and they literally would do this. The federal marshals would guide them off the bus into the opposing wait stations, and then continue, and then just keep them going into the police cars to take them to jail because what they were doing was still technically illegal. Not the bus riding, but then going into the different wait areas. It stopped the violence and stuff like that. But they didn't end up making it their whole journey that they wanted to. What it did do is it forced the Kennedy administration to take a stand on civil rights, which was way more important than anything else. So, okay, so all of this background and all these things are taking place, and all of these major changes are happening in the movement. And so what then coincides with this, of course, is that women wanting to be involved. One of the things that, like everywhere else, women found themselves within the civil rights movement being pushed aside. Which was frustrating in that prospect of that, of wanting to have a front row and be part of this, and then being told essentially that that they should focus on essentially women's issues in the process. You had a combination. So you had a combination of essentially what was racism and misogyny at the same time. They wanted to fight racism. They were being prevented from doing some of these things. Then women wanted to get involved in these various Black movements, and then they were told by those movements, "You're a woman. Go do womanly things, focus on women's issues. This isn't for you." This is going to lead women to be more proactive in the art scene and actually form their own groups because of it. Faith Ringgold was very active and also well-known activist, especially known for her posters, but other art as well. Posters were some of the things that were often created along with screen prints, because it was a great way of sharing political ideas. It was easy to reproduce. I don't think I have that one, so we'll put that here. So easy to reproduce and sell to raise money for the movement and stuff like that. And they were impactful, right? You could use them for at protests. You could make them into stickers. You could, put them up in a whole bunch of other places, right? There was something about like, a single individual piece of art, a larger painting that could be super impactful, but in terms of people viewing it and being able to see it, right, it was kind of more restrictive. But posters like that, it just worked to be able to use their art to make a statement, to protest, to be impactful, and then again, mass reproduce it, sell it, have multiple people holding it up. So it made sense that that was the case. And Faith Ringgold did a lot in posters. She had other art as well, but she certainly used screen prints and posters as one of her main mediums for that. She created this one here, with Women Free Angela. Angela Davis was an activist who was arrested and imprisoned by the FBI. And she actually, Faith Ringgold had several things where she promoted the what was seen as unfair, non-legal, maybe not legal, but certainly unfair discrimination in jailed activists and protesters, and even herself, that her posters often targeted, right? It uses the red, black, and green colors for the Pan-African flag. The triangles with the words conforming to the shapes were meant to not only create this abstract sense of art, but also be bold and eye-catching at the same time. She also used paper collage and stylistic characteristic lettering to stand out, that was meant to grab the viewer's attention. I'm going to skip down to these just so we can see the pictures. So she had this one here, right? The all power to the people, free all political prisoners. She had another one that she did that was that she made a poster for the People's Flag Show in 1970 that took place at Judson Memorial Church. And the artists were actually asked to make their own versions of the American flags. And her poster was one of the few posters that was actively printed and sold from that event. Here's the thing. There was only a few years later, Congress had passed a federal flag desecration law. which was meant to criminalize any destruction or defiling of the flag. Uh, and so the Judson Memorial Church made all the artists sign waivers. They had to sign these waivers. That basically said, like, they're not going to hold Judson responsible if anything happens, because they knew that they were pushing with this, right? And they basically said, like, look, if you get arrested, not on us, right? Don't blame us. And not everyone was, right? So it's still targeted specific Black protesters that were arrested. There were 3 people arrested because of, and I don't have the picture of that one, but she had another flag that she made. And because of her artwork, her and 2 other artists were arrested and fined $100 for desecration of the flag, which is just kind of a joke, and like the artwork of it. So this is in response to her arrest. She created another flag, and you can see it says Judson 3, which is in reference to the 3 that were arrested. You have the flag, which again using the Pan-African flag colors, and then the wording of Judson was meant to kind of look like jail cell bars, right? So you kind of see how, and it's like the whole flag being enclosed over by the bars. And she gets arrested, gets fined for desecration of the flag, and then goes out and does it again. She was not arrested again after this. The ACLU actually ultimately the charges were dropped with the ACLU fighting for her case. But it just shows her willingness and eagerness to use art to protest, to push back, to fight, and challenge the traditional systems and expectations of women, of Black people in general. Under the poster, it's not in here, but under the poster, she was quoted saying, "How dare you tell artists what they can do? That's the beginning of some really bad funk," which sounds super 70s. Bad, 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 right? How dare you tell artists what they can do? That's the beginning of some really bad funk. Bad, bad, bad. So again, actively pushing back against that. And then you have this one here. American People is the title for that one. And of course, just shows women and the bright colors meant to celebrate Black women as American people as well. She had several different ones that also showed Black and white women and men together, some highlighting violence against Black men and women, some that just showed them hanging out together. It was meant to, just as the Civil Rights Movement was, to push for equality, to push for the end of racism, to protest the treatment of Black women, were a lot of her posters and paintings that she did in that process. One of the other things I mentioned was the formation of Where We At Collective, and this was in response to women being regulated to women's issues. Again, basically, Black women were told as they tried to enter in and join a lot of these artistic movements to protest for the civil rights movement, that they needed to focus on women's issues and capitulate to male authority. And so this eventually led to women trying to create their own organization to push for their rights. Kay Brown, Denga McCannon, Faith Ringgold all gathered a group of Black women artists together at McCannon's house in Brooklyn to discuss their frustration with essentially the trying to build their careers as artists and participating as women, right? They were largely excluded from the white downtown art scene for being Black and the male-dominated Black art world as well. And they found that on top of that, of course the reality of having to be a female Black artist and have to fight against all of these different obstacles while also being a wife and a mother and working a job and juggling that creative ambition with children, with life, with working head of households, all while trying to promote their art. So the collective Where We At was essentially meant to create a Black women's gallery and support and create a collective that supported Black women artists. We've seen this before with the salons and other aspects in art that we've looked at, where women created these groups to support each other because they were largely pushed out of these other areas. And this is another example of that. They ended up opening an Acts of Art gallery in New York's West Village in 1971 and made that their title of it too, the Acts, oops, that's sloppy there, of Art. Excuse me. And this essentially, they met in members' homes, in studios, and in open buildings to create support systems for their work, while also helping each other with childcare and other needs and stuff like that. They also, of course, had a huge focus was on creating art for the civil rights movement and pushing for rights and equality in the process. The next one we're going to look at is Betty Saar. She did a lot with collages and empowerment. So instead of just paintings and posters, we were looking at three-dimensional collages. Her most famous by far is The Liberation of Aunt Jemima, which is this one here. But what she did is with her three-dimensional collages, so the point was to tell a story, and she would search yard sales and flea markets and slowly just pick up objects and items that she thought she could use. So she talked about how she would pick up advertisements, marketing materials, knickknacks, sheet music, toys. She also picked up anything that targeted myths and stereotypes about, well, her art targeted myths and stereotypes about race and femininity, but she mentioned that she also picked up anything that highlighted those stereotypes of race or femininity. She wanted in her artwork to challenge the negative ideas about Black women and racism. She was also part of the Black arts movement as well in that process. And so the Liberation of Aunt Jemima was inspired by an Aunt Jemima figurine that she found, or actually really the Mammy character is what it was also called. So to have the background on this, and these were common. So this is the initial Mammy character that she found. And then this is a postcard that she also found with it. And then this is Aunt Jemima. Actually, Aunt Jemima. Aunt Jemima was a specific name that was targeted to a product that actually most people probably should be aware of now because of there was a whole thing with the syrup. With Aunt Jemima I can speak syrup, not syrup. And just a couple of years ago, they got rid of the Aunt Jemima character, her face, and the kind of Jim Crow caricature that was actually used on the syrup. That only happened recently, where they stopped using those bottles. And I think they changed the name too. So it's not called Aunt Jemima anymore, but also the racist kind of caricature that was on the bottles was removed as well. So that only happened a few years ago that was fully removed. So this was a known product that was popular back then. So that's where the name Aunt Jemima comes from, and that's where you can see her face right there. That background was like a advertisement sheet for Aunt Jemima that she put as the background. But these characters here are called Mammy characters, and that was part of Jim Crow caricatures as well. So Jim Crow caricatures is part of and connected to Jim Crow laws and segregation. One of the things with segregation is that with creating segregation in the South, they wanted to normalize it. Jim Crow laws specifically. So we talk about laws. The laws were like separate but equal. So that there would be a separate drinking fountain for white people versus black people. There was separate entrances for the theater, where black people had to sit on the top floor of the theater. There was different hotels and so on, right? The idea of that everything, Jim Crow laws were essentially segregation. All the things that were separate, not equal, even though they were supposed to be, that you had to, you were required to follow and go into the proper entrance or location or sitting on the bus or whatever based on your race. That's the Jim Crow laws. Now, the Jim Crow caricatures were racist caricatures of black men and women that were specifically meant to be used in like, they tried to put them into like all these everyday objects. Salt and pepper shakers were super common. So a lot of household goods, kitchen goods, products like Aunt Jemima. But again, the salt and pepper shakers, there was like a bunch of other food products and stuff as well that had the Mammy character, postcards, games, the toys. The goal was to make it so prevalent that the imagery of women and men in these Jim Crow caricatures would be normalized so that people would not think it unusual when black men and women were criticized or called names, or that this is why we have a segregation, because they're other, because they're different. And it was really about normalizing this whole thing. I put a couple links to the Jim Crow Museum along within the additional information section. If you want to know more about it, it's really good to know and interesting as well. And the Jim Crow Museum does a really good job with going through all the caricatures, because there wasn't just the Mammy caricature. That was one. There were several, and there was a combination of both the friendly black servants, like the Mammy character, and then there was the sexually deviant, be dangerous characters, right? So in this case, the Mammy character was meant to be a friendly, non-dangerous, non-sexualized version, right? Where she's shown, and very typical, was shown with very black skin, the handkerchief, scarf over the head, excessive red lipstick and large lips, always with a smile, and then with cleaning supplies, right? She was the maid. She was the happy-go-lucky maid that took care of the home, looked after the children, and was not threatening. But also, in this case, both of the non-threatening caricatures of Jim Crow were also meant to be like not as intelligent either. That was especially with the male Jim Crow caricature. He was seen as like an idiot and a buffoon. The Mammy character, not so much, but definitely the male version, right? And then you had the sexualized version where young girls were shown pregnant and overly sexual. And then the male version was dangerous sexual predator, essentially. So she's found what she saw as these Mammy caricatures and figurines, and was inspired by the Aunt Jemima figurine. And decided to make this kind of collage box, right? So you have this figure that was put in, but what they added, you can see here, she added a rifle. So the figurine came with the broom. She added the rifle to it, right? Which was a big thing. There were laws that prevented black men and women from having guns in the South. And so it was meant to be seen as this form of resistance and empowerment, right? To not let the narrative of a white person determine how black women should view themselves. And instead, this idea of the liberation of Aunt Jemima from those expectations and caricatures, and instead was standing up and fighting back. You then also see that in the postcard here, where you have an Aunt Jemima, well, actually more the Mammy character, holding a child, again with smiling. But what is here is the fist, for black power and resistance, right? So that is also then put there to push against and say that these characters are standing up and resisting and pushing back against these stereotypes, against racism, and women can take control of their own imagery and meaning. This was a very popular piece, and was very much targeting and challenging the segregation, the Jim Crow laws, and suggesting that women fighting back and resisting for change. Um, she also had another piece. There's actually a couple here. Here's another one. Let's go first to, oh, if it's going to go to it, I might have to pause here if it doesn't want to switch. There we go. I guess my finger just had to use the mouse. Here again, you have some of those same kind of caricatures that are used on washboards, which are also appropriate because prior to washing machines, and sometimes even in the South still in the 1950s, 1960s, because not everyone had a, washing machines were now a thing in the 1950s. Not everyone had one. And the way you wash clothes before washing machines were with these washboards. And it was tedious, and it was a long process, often discussed as like all day process of washing clothes. And so unsurprisingly, right, that job was hated and given to servants as much as they possibly could. And the black women who were maids were definitely the ones that were doing this job, along with doing it for themselves as well. So she uses this instrument of cleaning and that the maids would have been using, that was seen as something that was tedious and almost beneath people to do, at least for white women. It wasn't always like that. Definitely in the early colonial periods, anyone was doing this. This is what you had to do. But by this point, right, you either were wealthy enough to have a washing machine, or if you weren't, you had ideally in the South, right, a black maid that would do the labor for you. So it was this symbol of that type of labor and work and somewhat disrespect that then they put on the characters to, again, challenge that system. And then this artwork here, it was called The Spirit Catcher. And was inspired by, and looks like traditional items used in rituals. It was created from bamboo, bones, feathers, shells, and wicker. She said the inspiration came from her visit to Africa, as well as the Tibetan spirit traps, which were blessed by shamans and then placed on the roofs to ward off evil. There's this, it also looks like a woman, kind of, right? You have the body, the arms, the head, and then kind of the dress structure. In the center, which was sometimes seen as like the evil eye, there was a mirror and was meant to like ward off evil spirits. And it certainly was this idea of this kind of loose shape of a woman using organic materials in the art, which was much of her art was meant to challenge, again, racism, empowering women, the strength of women, right? Women being able to ward off evil spirits, to protect, that type of thing. It was meant to highlight their strength and power in fighting for rights and pushing against traditional racist stereotypes, which was very much in her artwork itself. All right, and then the last one we're going to look at is Elizabeth Catlett's artwork as well. All right, so Elizabeth was born and raised in Washington, D.C. Both of her parents were children of formerly enslaved people. She graduated from Howard University, although she had wanted to be admitted into Carnegie Institute of Technology, and she technically was, until they realized that she was black, and then they withdrew her acceptance due to her race, as the schools were still segregated at this point in time. Much of her career was actually in teaching art, and then at the end and the near middle-ish of her life, she moved to Mexico to teach at the university there, and she was actually the first female professor of sculpture at that university. So, a big deal in terms of not only first woman, but the first black woman as well, to be able to teach sculpture. She started really her artist work with the Taller de Grafica Popular, the TGP, which was a famous workshop in Mexico City that was dedicated to graphic arts promoting leftist political causes social issues, and education. She and a lot of the other artists did a lot with linoleum cuts, or lino cuts, as it was. And her linoleum cuts often featured prominent Black figures, as well as posters, leaflets, and illustrations for textbooks and materials that she did to promote literacy in Mexico. Her probably most well known one is Sharecropper, which is this one here, which of course shows a woman sharecropper, which was a system that was adapted and created after the end of slavery and was still prominent in the South, and really kept people in this state of kind of servitude. It was an interesting mix because it was some former slaves that then worked on these plantations as sharecroppers, but also poor white Southerners found themselves having to work as sharecroppers as well after the war. And so it really was not only a combination of racism, but centered around this class, massive class difference of keeping the poor poor in the South. And so in this one, she showcases the woman with some light colors of black, brown, and green, but with the kind of the hat stylized in a slightly halo structure around her head, gazing forward and kind of looking proud and determined, while still, in the face of poverty, which is highlighted not only with like the basic structure of her clothes. You don't see a lot of it, but the fact that she has a safety pin holding her cloak together is indicative of that poverty. But it's also intentionally not meant to look over consuming in her face, although she looks like she has worked hard, and it's an older woman who has worked hard in her life. She's still meant to be seen as strong and positive and determined. And that was a lot of what her goal was, is showing is the lives of Black women in the South in this positive and strong manner, while still drawing attention to the inequitable system, in this case of sharecropping, but also of just the racist segregational practices as well. And in this case, sharecropping that created this continual cycle of debt and poverty. She also created the series I Am the Black Woman. It was a series of 15 lino cuts that highlighted work and contributions of Black women throughout history. Each artwork was meant to show Black women in different jobs and roles that they had done, and how they participated in throughout history, and were important to challenging segregation, racism, and just the importance of Black women in history as a whole. It was meant to create this narrative piece of power, resilience, and importance of Black women's labor and the role that they played in society. She created these artworks when she was at the TGP. And what's crazy with this is, because of these types of artworks, the United States ends up listing her on a list for dangerous people, barring her entry from the United States, even though she's a United States citizen. She's living in Mexico, but she's in the United States citizens, and they put her on a list and bar her from entry as a dangerous, potentially subversive person. Angry at this and frustrated with the injustice, she ends up later renouncing her citizenship and made Mexico her permanent home. All the while, though, refusing to stop fighting for displaying in her art and portraying women and fighting for the civil rights to showcase and highlight their role and the importance and stuff. So this one is that working hard for America, essentially, the idea that women aren't lazy. They have worked. They have done their labor. They have done their work in their life. All right, so that's I've always worked hard for America one, and then you have the next one and stuff. Here is the determined to organize the unorganized. This one is the idea of women working for, fighting against, creating protests and people, and pushing back against labor. Not disputes. I guess it could be disputes, but that then the organized labor, right, and the struggle to organize and fight for that labor. And then this one is my right is a future of equality with other Americans. So obviously these are just a few of the 15. But so you have women that are working, very hard in the domestic sphere of washing and scrubbing and somewhat looking like they're slaving away. But this was there. Each of these line of cuts was meant to like combat some criticism or statement that people had made about Black women and their role in the United States. And so, right, this proud, again, this pose of looking up and being proud of my right is to be equal with other Americans, right? I have always worked hard for America. I have worked hard and am determined to organize, and I've always struggled to organize the unorganized, right? So the idea, there was another one that there's one that said there are bars between me and the rest of the land, which showed a woman with which looked like a barbed wire, like kind of like a fence, probably for a farm, but the idea also being like jail or a camp and stuff. The idea that they're being restricted, that they've always been fighting against, but having this restriction. There's another one that was for the idea of like Rosa Parks, and it said I have special reservations, the idea of like I have special reservations to sit somewhere else. But all of these, like with their statements, were meant to highlight the roles that women had played, the strength that they had amongst this adversity, and their contributions and importance in society, to have it be seen as more than just, the criticism of women are lazy, or they aren't working, or whatever else, that this was meant to combat those based on her own experiences and feelings of being a Black woman, and the challenges that she faced, and also looking through history as well. Okay, so that's for what we're looking at and highlighting for art. The key with this is just that Black women artists were very active during the Civil Rights Movement, and a lot of their artwork, not all of it, I specifically selected things from each of these women's artwork collection that was towards kind of the Civil Rights Movement and pushing for reform and change. It certainly didn't mean every single artwork that they did, but that it was very much a push to want to be a part of the Civil Rights Movement, to use their art to support the Civil Rights Movement. And as this change was taking place during this time, with the protests, with the sit-ins, with the Freedom Riders, that artists found themselves being able to and many of these women also went to protest and did that as well. But they found that they had another skill that they could use, which was the power of art, of the visual representation, to sway people's minds, to change perceptions. And it really was the goal of all of these artists, was to use their talents and skills in art to create that visual representation, whether it be in the posters protesting political prisoners, whether it was in the collages with the 3D kind of box art, whether it was with the linoleum cuts. All of this was meant to create these visual representations that could create a powerful imagery, and again, also I think impact with the emotional response to the same kind of ideas that the other protests of the Civil Rights Movement were trying to create. And they all played a powerful role in, just like I mentioned with the scene, the treatment, and the photography and on TV of the sit-ins swayed a lot of people's minds. The artwork also helped sway people and empower people, and certainly empower Black women to continue pushing forward and seeing their value and worth, and boldly putting that out there to everyone else and saying, like, we are worthy of this, and that that visual representation plays a whole other kind of role in being powerful in that. And so they played a very important role in the civil rights movement through their artwork to highlight Black women and their roles and their place in society and the ways that they are fighting against stereotypes and racism, and showcasing kind of a very powerful message in the process. So we'll look at the feminist movement, which coincides and is kind of mixed with the civil rights movement in the